It's wonderful to be here with you this morning. As we move toward the vernal equinox on Tuesday, our attention turns to the subject of balance. Light and dark, inner and outer, living a balanced life in humanity with others. The children's story about buckets, if plotless, does assert a rather lovely theory of balance, which is that serving others, we become whole, and that we rise by lifting others. The caveat, or the dark side, we might say, of this theory is that it ignores the reality of burnout and overwhelm. And the truth is, if everything we did to balance ourselves was only in relationship to others, we'd get into trouble quickly. Service in relationship is really just part of the whole theory on balance. So how do we fill our own buckets in order to be a stable and capable contributor to the world? As a yoga asana teacher and student, so asana are the yoga poses, and someone who's done this practice for 30 years and taught yoga classes, the alignment, the poses, the whole roster of the practice for a long time, of course I'm very interested in the subject of balance by its various definitions. Indeed, in the last weeks, my life has been incredibly busy and harried, and at one point I turned to my husband Ken and I said, they've picked the wrong person to give this talk. I think we can theorize that all the experts on balance were out of town, and so what you have today is a practitioner or an amateur. But the truth is, I'm really deeply interested and forever on the path of attaining some sort of understanding of the nuanced and sometimes elusive experience of balance. Many teachings from the larger Indian tradition, of which I've been a student for a long time, have a lot to say on the subject of balance. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is a core text of the yoga tradition, collated from the great stream of classical yoga, advises the practitioner Sthira Sukha Asanam, which means a yoga posture is executed by the balance of effort and ease. So there's always this dynamic tension between the work and the rest in any pose. There is also the cultivation of what I call continuity of consciousness, which is the honing of a deep inner attention that grows over time in the practice. As the physical body becomes stable, there's an ensuing stabilization of the nervous system. The body, the mind, the breath, and the heart come into balance with each other. And it's not static balance. I know from my own asana practice and from teaching that a steady foundation, a rootedness and a strength toward the center yields a beautiful balancing posture, even one with wavering or modification. The restful stability that can be achieved in a yoga posture, including the difficult balance poses, demands a kind of mobile stability, a state aptly applied to daily life. In both the yoga poses and meditation, the practitioner learns to turn inward, to draw from inner resources, to subtilize movement, alignment, and breath, and to become one-pointed, engaged, and absorbed inwardly. This is why, incidentally, new fads like beer yoga and goat yoga and these other trends in the spiritual marketplace kind of mystify me. I'm not trying to be judgmental about it, but because the experience has become such a deeply internalizing thing for me, to add like this additional distraction, however fun it may be, is just a little antithetical. We all know that the reason that God invented beer is actually football, not yoga. And we also know that the invention of goats is kind of a mystery. Okay, Chev, no, they're adorable animals as long as they're not mine. So I digress. In Western psychology, there's a field of study called well-being theory, and it's put forth by a psychologist named Martin Seligman in his book called Flourish. In it, he identifies 5 pillars of well-being, which I will also mention is different from just happiness. Well-being is a very holistic state that includes positive emotion, but does not presume eternal happiness. It's a kind of wholeness instead. So I'm not a psychotherapist. I can't speak to the research or the clinical pros and cons of this approach, but I'm interested in it because of what it has to offer in this acronym of PERMA, P-E-R-M-A. It refers to the following: positive emotions like fulfillment, happiness, engagement, the ability to be deeply absorbed in something, relationships, the connection to ourselves and to people we value and who value us, meaning, finding worth and purpose in how we live, and achievement, the deploying of a growing body of gifts, talents, contributions. So I'm paraphrasing and I'm drastically summarizing the premise of this book, but these pillars pertain to how I see the practice as I do it in yoga and the subject of balance. The steadiness that I feel in my yoga practice and that I observe in my students has the quality of deep satisfaction and even happiness. A meditative engagement and absorption takes place in the silent, fluid places of a practice where one's attention is poured like oil, the Yoga Sutras say, in a steady, unbroken stream of awareness into the expression of those poses. Being a yoga practitioner is to be in deep relationship with yourself, your beauty, and your flaws, as well as to cultivate the capacity for that same depth with others. The meaning can often be found off the mat in the glow after a practice, or in the depth that one continues to experience when moving out into life. And achievement, the refining of knowledge, the physical capacity, the health and fitness, the resiliency, and the capability applies both on the mat and afterwards. The truth is that my yoga and meditation practices have saved my life. My practices have served to heal past trauma and misuse, to balance emotions, to generate resiliency, to create compassion and spaciousness, and to unify a once frayed nervous system and a life of relative imbalance. And as the practice deepens, so do the rewards. Indeed, the prescription for life brought forth from these wisdom traditions that we're citing today is that of sadhana. Sadhana, it's a Sanskrit word meaning coherent body of practice. It's a kind of conscious self-care, if we broaden the definition. So clearly, this means some very specific things for me. But I also invite you during this time and afterward to think of what this may mean for you. What activities, people, and resources bring you to these qualities of balance that we've just described? Since 2009, meditation, deep meditation, has been my pillar practice. And now I also teach the technique, which has been so balancing to me, to others who also seek that balance. We are wise to acknowledge that we are made of some balance of light and darkness. And this is likely to remain so through the course of our lived experience. But in the context of a coherent body of practice, the question then becomes, where do I place my attention? Where do I experience my identity? In the earlier reading, Pema Chodron explained the utility of wretchedness as a way to soften us into experiencing life and of being capable of presence and service to others. And gloriousness, per the tradition, is actually our fundamental nature, our birthright, though we likely don't experience it all the time. Knowing that we are comprised of both, that our light and our darkness carry us through the momentary or seasonal fluctuations of life, our solstices and equinoxes, we seek to find our way the best we can. But what we may find over time is that a relationship of light and darkness that is balanced only in terms of extremes, that is, really good sometimes and really bad at other times, or lifestyle or health habits that entail kind of a detox and then a retox pattern, we may continue to feel frayed and empty and even wretched at times. There's a traditional teaching axiom: the burnt seed cannot sprout. This is an understanding that our darkness lies within us in seed form, comprising our habits of limitation, addiction, depression, anxiety, and stress. Here's what the tradition prescribes: burn the seeds of your suffering in the fire of practice, in deep meditation, in order that those patterns will no longer activate in our life choices and continuously propel us toward darkness and suffering. If we can enact practices that successfully neutralize and remove these activators out of our negativity, then darkness inside us begins to exist simply as a part of our humanity. Maybe as sadness or as memory, but also as a great source of compassion for the suffering of others. Yet, it no longer needs to be a hobble to our own gloriousness and freedom. Unburdened by some of that compelling darkness, we begin to serve from a place of light. Our bucket, now full, has much to offer to others. To be clear, as people who live in the world, not as renunciates, we can't just disappear from our life to pursue our internal practices for great stretches of time. The image we invoke to describe a life of practice in the householder tradition is that of dyeing cloth. Traditionally, I'm told, the way that textiles were dyed in India involved a technique of alteration between dyeing and bleaching. In other words, to create a rich, color-fast hue in a garment, you didn't simply put the cloth in the vat of dye and leave it there for a long period of time. At one point, the cloth simply saturates and can't take on any more of the dye. The process, then, is that at the right moment, the cloth is removed, rinsed, and allowed to dry and bleach in the sun. And at first, almost all of the color bleaches out. With repeated soaking, rinsing, and drying, however, more and more of the color remains in the cloth until the deeply saturated hue and color fastness is achieved. This is an analogy that my meditation teacher and his meditation teacher before him used to describe practice. It's the deep silence of meditation that we steep in a more potent expression of our own consciousness. And each time we come out to enact the duties and responsibilities of the world, we bleach a little, or a lot. But then, back in we go. And again, with repeated practice over a long period of time, life begins to take on the hue of that depth, light, and wholeness that we locate inside. Eventually, every part of our waking identity begins to be located in that depth. We're no longer depleted or bleached by outer circumstances, challenging as they may remain. You see, in the householder tradition, individual identity isn't a problem. You're not a problem to be solved. What matters is where identity is located. Is it in the changeable surface of life, in the results of my efforts, or in my old pain? Or can it be more and more deeply stabilized in a space inside myself that is silent, potent, and free, even as my activities, duties, and pleasures in the world continue? There's a space, you see, deep inside each of us where the transcendent space of consciousness and our individuality converge. It's a pivot point where to one side is the velvety darkness of a kind of unmanifest silence of our own inner being from which everything else arises, seemingly empty, yet completely full. And then on the other side, this complete bright unfurling of any and every kind of creative impulse, the objects that we perceive, our ideas and our knowledge. the entire unfurling of reality as we perceive it. This is said to be the ledge of infinite stability and infinite freedom. It's a stance where you can both rest and enact life, rooted in a perfect, potent silence and simultaneously experientially engaged in the unfolding like a knife edge, first located in the very deep states of meditation. Life enacted from this place is different. From this place beyond the limitations of negative thoughts, habits, and addictions, we can live the best and fullest vantage point for creating beauty, for empowered speech, for deep knowledge and perception, and for spontaneous right action, knowing what to do when, as we rest in this subtle and stable place. It's thrilling, it's not boring. And from this place, anything enacted is harnessing a deep will from inside. This is the engine that the yoga tradition recommends for enacting daily life. It's infinitely practical. It's a balance between inner rest and outer activity, and it becomes the source place of discernment, expression, and action. We invoke the image of a tree deeply rooted in the deepest and richest soil and extending higher and higher and higher in its branching complexity, fruiting and flowering in an infinitely creative way. There's no top end. This is a path of infinite expression and refinement. It's that exquisite je ne sais quoi that Stafford alluded to in his poetry. It's what Naveen spoke of in his music, this balance of stability and freedom with a flavor and a nectar that engenders a thrilling mastery, what Seligman called accomplishment. This is how life can be deployed toward any auspicious desire, creativity, relieving the suffering of others, or simply living a life that is anchored in balance. We recognize it when we see it in those rare beings that bless the planet, a kind of deep sanity and serenity that is a gift to anyone who encounters it. To be engaged in the world only at the surface is to continually be pulled out of balance, warn the wise. There are just too many things that need or demand our daily attention, and the world wisdom tells us that it has ever been so. Like a choppy ocean, life at the surface is changeable, unpredictable, and at times challenging. To quote another famous yogi, "The future ain't what it used to be." That's Yogi Berra. But he also philosophizes, if the world was perfect, it wouldn't be. And this is actually a very apropos gloss on the teaching that life has its inherent messiness, imperfection, and even wretchedness. And yet, underlying that is this gloriousness, the sublime, the happiness and the wholeness that is to be found through a life that is skillfully attuned to locate it. May it be so, and blessed be.